Christian faith professes that human history is on the move, and that it's on the move in a direction of God's choosing. Rather than an endless cycle, human history has what we might call directionality. It's rarely a straight line, though. The twists and turns of human free will, sin, and its effects work to delay God's best intent, and the forces of evil do their best to derail it altogether. And yet, Christian faith believes there is an end, and in the end, God wins. Often either abused or ignored, the book of Revelation offers us a glimpse of God's best intent, a glimpse of the world as it will be when God wins. So it's there, in John's vision, that we find the view from the end of time.
I think, if I had to guess, my first real encounter with justice came, as it did for many children of the 80s, in the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Wapner on the People's Court. Some of you are laughing because you know exactly of what I speak, but maybe you aren't familiar. In the decades since the People's Court first aired, there have been lots and lots of knockoffs. And as time has gone on, some of them have leaned into the comedy side of things, and some have taken an almost Jerry Springer-like approach to tabloid TV. But if you know Judge Wapner, he was the OG. Like, he was the real deal, no-nonsense kind of guy. The People's Court first aired in late 1981. And it might surprise you to learn that it would air in its original incarnation for 12 seasons and just shy of 2,500 episodes. And each one began with the same iconic opening. What you are about to see is real. The participants are not actors. They are actual litigants with a case pending in a California municipal court. Both parties have agreed to dismiss their court cases and have their disputes settled here in our forum. You see, before survivors were surviving and Big Brother was watching and bachelors and bachelorettes were tossing out roses, the People's Court was reality TV in all of its glory. And each week the cases were different, which meant the litigants were different, but there were some things you knew you could expect. At the helm, or rather on the bench, was the aforementioned Honorable Judge Wapner. Alongside him was the cast of characters that made up the courtroom that were the same every week. That iconic opening was voiced by announcer Jack Harrell. There was Rusty the bailiff, and the court reporter, Doug Llewellyn. His job was to talk to litigants after the ruling was rendered and find out just how satisfied or dissatisfied they were with Judge Wapner's justice. And he would end every episode with the same sort of iconic speech. And he would usually find some clever, witty way to tie into one of the cases. But Doug Llewellyn, at the end of every episode, would say, that's right, if you're in a dispute with another party and can't seem to work things out, don't take the law into your own hands. Take them to court, the People's Court. In every episode, the case would be heard, questions would be asked, facts would be presented, and a ruling would be delivered. And as a viewer at home on your sofa, you had a sense that justice had been done. Now, The plaintiff or the defendant may not be happy with Judge Wapner's ruling. But there was something within you that you knew you could trust Judge Wapner to do the right thing. You could trust him to be fair, to be impartial. You could trust him to be just. And you had a sense that someone had been wronged. Something wasn't the way it was supposed to be. And somebody should do something about it. And in the courtroom of the People's Court, that someone was the Honorable Judge Wapner. See, it seems there's something within us that is hardwired to long for justice to be done. It seems there is something within us that longs for a better world. A world where things are as they should be. A world where there isn't suffering and violence and abuse or manipulation. There's something within us that longs for justice. Christian faith would say that hard wiring in us is a reflection of the image of God. That when we are longing for a world that is just, when we're longing for a world without violence, without suffering, without abuse and manipulation, we are longing for the world the way it was intended to be. That we're longing for the world as it once was, longing for the world the way it was before its goodness was stripped away by sin and its effects. And just as powerfully, Christian faith would make the claim that when we long for that sort of world, we aren't simply longing for the world as it once was or the world as it should be. We are longing for the world as it will be when all is said and done. When the end finally comes. That this longing for a sense of justice, for wrongs to be righted, for someone to do something about everything that isn't the way it should be, that longing will be satisfied for the people of God. I want to invite you to turn with me to the book of Revelation, chapter 21 this morning. If you've been tracking with us, we've been in the midst of this conversation around the New Testament's final book for the last few weeks, getting this overview, this bird's eye view, right? We're 4 weeks in and we're wrapping up the book today, so this has not been a deep dive by any stretch of the imagination. But we come now finally to the end of the book that describes for us the end of all things. If you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app on a smartphone or tablet, you can find everything on a screen that is on the screen will be in the events tab there. You can take some notes as you go along if that's helpful to you. But we want to begin in Revelation chapter 21 in verse number 1. John writes this. He says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' And he who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.'" Now jump ahead with me to chapter 22. We're going to skip over a section here. We're going to be moving around a bit in the text of these last few chapters today. See this in chapter 22, verse 1. "Then the angel showed me the river, the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. And on each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. And the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And there will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of a sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. So John here, in his vision, catches a glimpse, not of heaven, but of a new heaven and a new earth. A new Jerusalem, the holy city that comes down from heaven, where God dwells with his people. Once more, the people of God in the presence of God. And what John sees in this city is hard for him to capture in words, hard for him to describe, tipped off by the fact that this city comes down adorned like a bride for her husband. I'm not sure how a city looks like a bride. I'm not sure what that visual is. But the point John wants to make is that we've already seen one city, Babylon, and she was a prostitute. And so everything that Babylon was, New Jerusalem is not. And everything that New Jerusalem is, Babylon was not. And John begins to describe this view from the end of time, and catches a glimpse of a world made new. Catches a glimpse of a world as it once was, a world as it should be, a world as it will be when sin is undone. Did you catch what he said? There was no more curse. Sin and its effects have been undone in this moment. And the presence of God dwells with his people. Once more, we who have been cut off from God's presence by our sin and brokenness are welcomed in to the presence of God and access not simply to the tree of life, but a whole flippin' orchard. And the curse has been undone. It's been said that the biblical story begins in a garden and ends in a city. And that's true. That's what John is describing. But we shouldn't miss the fact that this particular city looks a lot like that particular garden. There is a symmetry and a full circleness that exudes from what God has been doing in this world. And we start to understand the end with some real clarity. It's there in the teaching notes. If you're following along, want to jot some things down, you can fill in some blanks. You see, when we begin with the end in mind, we realize that the end has the beginning in mind. When we begin with the end in mind, the way things will be in the end, what we soon realize is that the end of all things recalls the beginning. The end has the beginning in mind. And so that longing that is in us, that longing for a world as it was, for the world as it should be, that longing for a world as it will be, is ultimately a longing for a world that is just, where the wrongs have been made right. But if we aren't careful, we can begin to long for a kind of justice that merely reflects our brokenness. Wait a minute. Justice and brokenness, those kind of seem like opposite ends of the spiritual spectrum here. What do you mean? I'm so glad you asked, because this is really, really vital to understanding what John has been trying to say throughout this entire book. If we aren't careful, we can begin to long for a justice that merely reflects our brokenness, a kind of justice that says vengeance for them and mercy for me and those most like me. We can begin to long for a sort of justice that wants vengeance poured out on our enemies and grace poured out upon ourselves. And John tells us in the end, one judge will rule and justice will be done. And when he does, the world that we have been longing for will once more be renewed. And the people of God will find themselves in the presence of God, and all will be as it should be. But how do we get there, right? Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands because, some of you won't. But let's just be real, okay? But if I were to ask you, would anyone question that the world as it is not the way we wish it was? Is not the world that we long for? The world as it once was, the way the world is, isn't the way that we hope the world will be when all is said and done. Otherwise, we're just trapped in this vicious cycle that just keeps spinning around and around and around. So how do we get there? Because if the world isn't as it should be or we long for it to be, but John has given us a glimpse to say it gets there. How? For this, we have to back up a bit to some things we talked through last week. If you were with us, you may recall, and if not, I'll refresh your memory. But we saw this encounter last week between a great beast that rises out of the sea. And John reveals that behind the beast stands the power of the dragon. And it's one of those times he tells us explicitly what his symbols mean. The dragon is that old serpent. And the beast, the city that sits on 7 hills, empowered by the dragon. For John and his audience, the city that would immediately come to mind would be the city of Rome. The might of the empire weighing down upon them. But John says there's this conflict between the beast and the dragon and the rider on the white horse. And he describes the rider in a way that makes it painfully clear this is the risen Christ who we met at the beginning of the book. Jesus, who walked among the lampstands with a message for his churches. And because of the way we tend to read the book of Revelation, we go, all right, here it is. Here it comes. War, annihilation, things going boom. And instead, the rider on the white horse merely speaks. And the great climactic battle that John has been building us up to anticipate never happens. And he's tried to tell us that was going to be the case, because when the rider on the white horse appears, he comes with the host of heaven who are dressed in white raiment. They aren't dressed for battle, they're dressed for a victory celebration. Because the battle that matters has already been won by the Lamb looking as if he had been slain. But you might remember as we wrapped up last week, we said the story doesn't quite end there. The beast is thrown down and in fact is cast into a lake of fire, and the dragon, who stands behind the beast, is chained and imprisoned for 1,000 years. And this is one of those points in the book of Revelation where everybody's like, oh, what does that mean? And we start going on all 1,000 different directions, right? So don't do that. Come back together. Come in, all right? Remember, we're not doing details. We're trying to get the big picture. So don't go 1,000 different directions about the 1,000-year, stuff. John tells us that the dragon is caged and imprisoned for 1,000 years and then released. And while he's caged, the rider on the white horse rules and reigns over the world as it should be, with peace and justice. And we go, finally, that's the world we've been longing for. But as soon as the dragon is unleashed, he resumes doing what he does best, and he begins deceiving the nations, who once again rally to his cause. If you were with us last week, you might remember that heartbreaking line in the middle of the book. The people worshiped the beast, and they worshiped the dragon. And once more, near the end of the book of Revelation, the dragon rallies the kingdoms of the world to his side, and they stand ready to fight against the people of God. And this time, they are consumed. Fire falls from heaven, destroying the dragon and his armies, who are thrown into the lake of fire to join the beast who had gone there before them. And we begin to get closer to how do we get from the world as it is to the world as it should be, the world as it once was, the world as it will be. Because those who choose to follow the path of the beast ultimately share the fate of the beast. Let's back up to Revelation chapter 20 and see how we get to new creation. Verse number 11, Revelation 20. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. For the lake of fire is the second death. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. And we're left with this moment of saying, how do we get from here to there? From the way the world is to the way the world once was, to the way the world that we long for it to be, the way the world as it will be in the end. And it's this, in the end, Jesus is coming to set everything right, which requires the removal of everything wrong. And what John wants to make clear for us is that evil cannot merely be contained. It must be destroyed. While the dragon was caged, the world seemed to be as it should be, the way that we think we long for it to be. But as soon as he is released, he begins deceiving the nations, who once more rally to his cause. And if we want to know how do we get from here to there, from the way the world is to the way that we long for it to be, the way that the world once was, the way God intended it to be, the way that God promises it will be, it's one of those times that the basic Sunday school answer is right. How do we get there? Jesus. Jesus will come and set everything right, which requires the removal of everything wrong. See, this is where the potency of John's message lies for us as the people of God, though. Because even here in the defeat of evil, there is a temptation within us. There is a temptation for us to model our response after the way of the beast, after the way of the dragon. Even here in the defeat of evil, there is a temptation at work within our hearts to long not for justice, but for vengeance. To long for the sort of justice that is fueled by the dragon. To long for the sort of justice that fuels and empowers the beast and its thirst for power. There is, even here in the defeat of evil, a temptation within us to fight evil with evil, to repay evil for evil. And if we don't think that isn't playing out in real time in the world around us, we aren't paying attention. Now, this is one of those times I need to give you a disclaimer. Right? Some of y'all are getting nervous. It's all right. Loosen up. We're good. We're not done yet. All right? Hang with me till the end. What I mean by that is not that it's the end of the world. It's unfolding around us. That's the way we usually read Revelation, right? We find the stuff in the headlines that kind of sounds like what John's talking about, and we start drawing straight lines and go, this is it. Okay, that's not what I'm doing. But if we don't think that this cosmic struggle John is outlining between the way of the beast in conflict with the way of the Lamb and the people of God being tempted to choose the way of the beast to accomplish the purposes of the Lamb, we aren't paying attention. And I don't care who you vote for, because it's all the way around. Right? So don't try to read between the lines. What do you say? Not saying anything. What I'm saying is this conflict that John describes for us is playing out in real time every day around us. On the airwaves of CNN and Fox News, on the Facebook feed, on the Twitter feed. It's playing out all around us. And the temptation for the people of God is the same. To follow the way of the beast, to accomplish the purposes of the Lamb. And John tells us what that results in. Those who follow the path of the beast share in the fate of the beast. But, y'all were waiting for the but, right? Get a little heavy, get a little hard, all right? But what we can be confident of is this: the final justice that John describes for us is rooted in the character of the judge. The final justice that John describes is rooted in the heartbeat and the character of God. So what does the heartbeat of God look like for a world that is not as it should be? All the way back in the Old Testament, we hear the prophet Ezekiel, who was instructed to write this to the people of Israel. If you think Revelation is a heavy, weird read, tackle Ezekiel, Okay, he and John, birds of a feather, right? Lots of weird stuff going on. But listen to what the Lord tells him to say to the people of God. Son of man, say to the house of Israel, this is what you're saying. Our offenses and sins weigh us down, and we're wasting away because of them. How then can we live? Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, O house of Israel? And so, if the final justice that John describes is rooted in the character of God, and God is who he says he is, that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And we go, well, of course. Of course God doesn't take pleasure in the death of the wicked. But the temptation is to say, well, of course God doesn't do things that way, while embracing a gleeful perspective that says, just wait. They'll get theirs. But the final justice that John describes is not a gleeful moment of vengeance against the enemies of God. It is a moment of lament. A moment that comes face to face with the reality that even in light of the good news of Jesus, even in light of the fact of his death and resurrection, some will choose rebellion. Some will choose sin and death and the way of the beast. And John understood far more powerfully than I think we comprehend just exactly how ripe a temptation that is for the people of God. But that is not God's intent. In fact, the final words that Jesus speaks to us in the book, in the New Testament as a whole, make clear that is not God's intent. Let's jump ahead to Revelation chapter 22. Starting in verse 12. We hear Jesus say this, "Behold, I'm coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to everyone according to what he has done. I'm the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may go through the gates into the city. Outside are the dogs, those who practice magic arts, the sexually immoral, the murderers, the idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star." Verse 17, "The Spirit and the bride say, 'Come.' And let everyone who hears say, 'Come.' Whoever is thirsty, let him come. Whoever wishes, let him take the free gift of the water of life." Just before that, the angel that has been communicating all of this to John comes to him and instructs him not to seal up the words of this book. And we go, what's that about? was this thing that happened in the Jewish writings that were a lot like Revelation around this time. Often the prophet who was being given this message was instructed to seal up the book, keep it a secret. And John is explicitly told by the angel, do not seal this message. Let those who will choose evil choose evil. Let those who will choose righteousness choose righteousness, and make sure they know exactly where that leads. Do not seal up the words of the book. Remember, one of those misconceptions we talked about at the beginning is Revelation tries to be confusing. No, here at the end we're reminded the point is to reveal truth, to make it known. So don't seal it up. Jesus takes the stage one last time and says, behold, I'm coming soon. And renews an invitation for whosoever will to come. To those who are thirsty, come and drink. To those who are longing for the world as it once was, who are longing for the world to be as it should be, those who are longing for the world to be as it once more will be in the end, come and drink freely from the water of life. See, guys, what we have to understand about the final picture John gives us of the end is that God's justice doesn't look to exclude, but it does allow us, as it has from the beginning, to choose death and to opt out of our rightful place in his kingdom. Right? That sense of justice that is a reflection of our brokenness tries to figure out who the enemy is so that we can cut them off. The justice of the one true judge is only interested in determining who the enemies are so he knows who to love. God's justice isn't trying to exclude, but God, as he has from the beginning, allows us the option to opt out, to choose death. God's justice doesn't look to exclude, but John makes it clear, not all will enter the gates of New Jerusalem. Why? Remember that garden way back in the beginning where we were cut off from access to the tree of life because of a fateful choice involving the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That moment when God said, here's the one thing you don't get to do in the garden is determine for yourself right and wrong. You don't get to determine what is good and what is evil. Only the judge gets to do that. It's striking that here at the end, we have a picture that clearly has the beginning in mind. We have the tree of life, not just a tree, lining the streets, yielding up its fruit every month. You know what's not present? No more tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If New Jerusalem is a reflection of Eden, it is an incomplete reflection because the choice has already been made. Those who enter have said yes. The judge gets to determine right and wrong. I will not usurp his authority. I will not decide for myself. And so Jesus issues this invitation to whoever is thirsty to come. Remarkably, when John describes the city of New Jerusalem, he describes it as a city filled with gates. But the gates never close. In the ancient world, the point of a city gate was twofold. It was to protect everyone who's supposed to be inside. And it's supposed to keep out anybody who's not supposed to be inside. And John's picture of the end is of a city with gates flung open wide, saying, whoever will may enter in. But know who the king is when you do. God's justice isn't looking for ways to exclude. He's merely doing what he has always done. He will allow us, as he has from the beginning, to choose rebellion, to choose death, to choose sin, and the way of the dragon. Invite the band to come back. There's this thing in us, guys, that we are hardwired for justice. And yet there's a temptation for us to really long more for vengeance than we do for justice. But one day Jesus tells us he will come and set everything right. And part of what it means to set everything right is to remove everything that is wrong. There's an old saying I'm sure you've heard in some form or fashion. If loving whatever is wrong, I don't want to be right. That's a really good encapsulation of John's vision of what is true at the end. Because the invitation Jesus puts before us is an invitation to set aside the things that are killing us and the things that will lead us to eternal death. And when we look around at the world, the temptation, even for the people of God, is to take an approach to the kingdom of God and say, I want that. But if loving this is wrong, maybe right is overrated. So Jesus gives us this invitation to set aside all the things that are killing us and enter into a city that is open to all. An entry into New Jerusalem doesn't come down to how good you've been, how hard you've tried. It comes down to the fact that the Lion of the tribe of Judah has triumphed by becoming a lamb who was slain. By refusing the trap of the way of the beast that says, I will fight evil with evil, might makes right, and don't worry, one day they'll get theirs. So the invitation to New Jerusalem is simply rooted in following the way of the Lamb, what we often talk about here of the ways and words of Jesus, saying yes to him, acknowledging that he is king. Saying, yeah, my brokenness, my sin, my rebellion against the kingship of God, I gotta let it go. I have to let what Jesus did on the cross, the power of his resurrection, to count for me and make Would you bow your heads with me?